Picture this. A boy emperor, barely old enough to grow a beard, watches from his palace window as the greatest empire in human history crumbles to ash around him. The year is 476 AD, and in a matter of hours, 1,000 years of Roman dominion will end forever. But here's what the history books won't tell you. This boy emperor isn't just watching Rome die. He's making a choice that will echo through eternity, a decision so shocking that it will rewrite everything we thought we knew about power, honor, and the price of survival. The smell of burning hits you first, not the clean smoke of hearth fires, but the acrid stench of a world on fire. Marble statues lie shattered in streets where Caesar once walked in triumph. In the imperial palace, Romulus Augustulus, a name that would become both mockery and legend, holds the weight of an impossible choice. This is not just the story of an empire's death. This is a secret tale of how the last Roman emperor discovered that sometimes the greatest act of power is knowing when to surrender it. But before we witness that final, earth-shattering moment, we must first understand what Rome truly was and why its fall would plunge the world into centuries of darkness. Tonight, we journey to the very heart of power itself, to watch it beat its last magnificent breath. Close your eyes and feel the marble beneath your feet, not cold, but warm from centuries of sunlight, polished smooth by the touch of slaves, senators, and gods walking among mortals. This is Rome in her death throes. But even dying, she remains the most beautiful creature the world has ever known. The year is 475 AD, and if you could stand on the highest tower of the Palatine Hill, you would see something that would break your heart with its terrible magnificence. Stretch your gaze beyond the 7 hills, past the Tiber winding like a silver serpent toward the sea, and witness an empire that once stretched from the midst of Britain to the burning sands of Mesopotamia. 3 million square miles of conquered earth, home to 60 million souls who called themselves Roman, all of it now balanced on the trembling shoulders of a boy who has just turned 16. But here's what makes this moment so hauntingly beautiful. Romulus Augustulus doesn't yet know he's the last. In his young mind, he still believes in the myth that his tutors whispered to him in childhood, the sacred lie that Romans had told themselves for 1,000 years, that their city was eternal, blessed by the gods, destined to rule until the stars themselves grew cold. Walk with him now through the corridors of the palace of Ravenna, where his father Orestes has moved the court for safety, fleeing the chaos of Rome itself. The walls here are decorated with mosaics that tell the story of Roman glory. Golden tesserae catch the light like trapped fire, depicting eagles with wings spread wide over conquered nations, triumph after triumph spiraling up towards ceilings painted to look like heaven itself. The boy's feet make no sound on marble floors inlaid with precious stones pillaged from a dozen kingdoms. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, where Alexander once walked. Porphyry from Egypt, where Cleopatra once dreamed of Roman love. Ivory from the heart of Africa, where elephants trumpeted their last breaths as Roman hunters claimed their tusks for empire. Every step the young emperor takes is upon the dreams and bones of the conquered world. But listen, do you hear that sound echoing through the palace halls? It's not the confident chant of Praetorian guards anymore. It's something else, something that makes servants look over their shoulders and senators whisper prayers to gods they're not sure still listen. It's the sound of an empire holding its breath, waiting for something terrible and inevitable to arrive. And it's coming faster than anyone dares imagine. To understand the magnitude of what we're witnessing, you must first understand what Rome truly was at the height of her power. This was not merely a city or even an empire. It was an idea made flesh, a dream of order imposed upon the chaos of the world with such magnificent brutality that even now, 1,500 years later, we still measure greatness against her shadow. Picture Rome in her golden age, just 3 centuries before our young emperor's time. The city herself was home to over 1 million souls, a number that would not be reached again by any European city until London in the 1800s. The streets thrummed with life from before dawn until long after midnight. A symphony of languages from every corner of the known world. Latin mixed with Greek, Celtic with Germanic tongues, the musical sounds of Egyptian merchants haggling with Syrian silk traders, while in the background, the constant percussion of hammers, shaping an empire that seemed to grow stronger with each passing year. The Romans had achieved something that no civilization before or since has managed. They had made diversity itself a weapon of conquest. When their legions marched into a new territory, they didn't simply destroy what they found. They absorbed it, transformed it, made it Roman while allowing it to remain itself. A Gallic warrior could become a Roman citizen. An Egyptian priest could serve Roman gods. A Germanic chieftain could command Roman soldiers. It was conquest through seduction as much as through the sword. But by the time our story begins, that great machine of assimilation has begun to turn in reverse. Now, instead of Rome changing barbarians into Romans, barbarians are changing Rome into something unrecognizable. Young Romulus Augustulus wakes each morning in chambers that his great-great-grandfather might not recognize as Roman at all. His guards are Germanic foederati, barbarian allies who fight for Rome but dream of their own homelands. His advisors speak Latin with accents that would have horrified Cicero. Even his own name carries the bitter irony of history. Romulus, after the legendary founder of Rome, and Augustulus, Little Augustus, a diminutive that transforms the sacred title of the first emperor into something almost mocking. Each morning, he performs rituals that stretch back through the centuries, but they become hollow ceremonies, words spoken to gods who seem increasingly distant. He wears the purple of empire, but the dye comes from barbarian lands because the old trade routes have been severed by war. He signs documents with ink made from recipes preserved in monastery scriptures because the great workshops of Egypt no longer send their goods to Roman markets. The transformation is so gradual, so subtle, that most Romans don't even realize it happening. Like a man slowly going blind, they adapt to each new limitation, each new darkness, until they forget what it was like to see clearly. But there are moments, quiet moments in the early morning when the city stirs to life, when the young emperor looks out his window and catches glimpses of what Rome used to be. He sees it in the way sunlight still falls golden on marble columns, in the way water still flows through aqueducts built by engineers who solved problems that modern builders could barely comprehend. He hears in the Latin words that slaves still sing as they go about their work, preserving in their simple songs the rhythms and vowels of an empire that once spoke with the voice of absolute authority. But what he doesn't yet know, what history is preparing to teach him in the cruelest possible way, is that all of this beauty, all of this accumulated glory, is about to vanish forever, and the instrument of that vanishing is already walking toward the palace gates, his footsteps echoing like the approach of destiny itself. His name was Odoacer, and he was everything that Romans had been taught to fear and despise made flesh. And yet, by the twisted irony of history, he would prove to be more Roman than most Romans. Picture him as he appears in historical accounts, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of weathered face that comes from sleeping under foreign stars and eating the bread of a dozen different kingdoms. He was a Germanic chieftain, probably Syrian, though his bloodline carried a mixed heritage of the frontier, that dangerous borderland where civilization met wilderness and often found itself changed by the encounter. But here's what makes Odoacer's story so fascinating, so heartbreakingly complex. He didn't want to destroy Rome. He wanted to become her savior. For 30 years, he had served the empire faithfully, commanding barbarian auxiliaries in Roman armies, learning Roman tactics, Roman law, Roman dreams of order and glory. He had studied the empire from within, understood her strengths and weaknesses better than most senators who had never left the comfortable shadows of their Roman villas. And what he had learned was this: Rome was dying not because barbarians were destroying her, but because Romans themselves had forgotten how to be Roman. The court at Ravenna buzzed with rumors of his approach throughout the summer of 476. Messengers arrived daily with reports that made senators pale and young Romulus Augustulus lie awake staring at painted ceiling gods who seemed to mock him with their serene, eternal faces. Odoacer was marching south with an army of foederati, barbarian allies who had been promised payment for their service to Rome, but had been betrayed by an empire too poor to keep its word. This is where our story takes a turn that would seem impossible if it weren't documented by historians who witnessed it themselves. Odoacer wasn't leading a barbarian invasion in the traditional sense. He was leading a Roman revolution, barbarians who had become more committed to Roman ideals than the Romans themselves. Watch now as the young emperor receives the reports that will change everything. The Gothic general has captured Milan without a siege. The city opened its gates to him willingly. He has crossed the Po River, and the Roman garrisons there have not just surrendered, they have joined him. Most shocking of all, he carries with him a document that makes the blood drain from every Roman face that reads it. A petition, signed by representatives of the Roman Senate itself, requesting his intervention to save the empire from itself. The irony cuts so deep it draws blood from the soul. The last Roman emperor is about to be deposed not by enemies of Rome, but by men who love Rome so much they are willing to break every tradition, every sacred custom, to preserve what they can of her greatness. But as autumn shadows lengthen across the marble floors of the palace, young Romulus Augustulus still doesn't understand the choice he's about to face. He still believes in the fairy tales his tutors told him about Roman invincibility, about the sacred nature of his authority, about the gods who supposedly watch over the eternal city with special favor. He is about to learn that the gods have been sleeping for a very long time, and when they wake, they speak with barbarian voices. To truly understand the magnitude of what about to unfold, we must step back and examine the brutal arithmetic that doomed the Roman Empire. Numbers written in blood and gold, equations balanced with human lives, calculations that even the greatest minds of antiquity couldn't solve. By 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire was bleeding money like a wounded giant. The treasury that had once overflowed with tribute from conquered nations now echoed empty, its vaults haunted by the ghost of former wealth. The mathematics were simple and terrible. Rome needed approximately 400,000 soldiers to defend her borders, but maintaining such an army cost more than the entire empire could produce in revenue. Each legionnaire required not just his pay, but equipment forged from iron increasingly difficult to obtain, food transport across supply lines constantly threatened by raiders, and veteran benefits that promised land and security to men who had served their 25 years faithful to the Eagle standards. The empire had become a military machine so expensive that it was eating itself alive. But the economic crisis was just the surface of something deeper, more fundamental, a crisis of identity that had been building for centuries like pressure beneath a volcano. The Germanic tribes that Romans called barbarians weren't barbarians at all. Not really. They were complex societies with their own laws, their own concepts of honor, their own traditions of kingship and loyalty, that in many ways were more robust than the corruption-weakened systems of late Rome. When these tribes served as foederati, allied auxiliary troops, they brought with them not just strong sword arms, but strong ideas about how just society should function. Odoacer himself was the perfect example of this complexity. Historical records show that he was literate in both Latin and Greek, familiar with Roman law and legal precedent, respected by Roman citizens in the territories he governed. When he looked at the empire he served, he saw what many Romans couldn't or refused to see, that the system was broken beyond repair, corrupted by centuries of political games that put personal advancement above public service. The young emperor's father, Orestes, represented everything that was wrong with late imperial Rome. He had gained power not through merit or popular support, but by betraying his previous master, the Emperor Julius Nepos, whom he had driven into exile just 1 year earlier. His solution to every problem was violence. His answer to every challenge was betrayal, and now his chickens were coming home to roost with Germanic efficiency. As reports reached Ravenna of Odoacer's steady advance, Orestes made a decision that would seal his son's fate and end the Western Empire forever. Rather than negotiate, rather than seek a diplomatic solution that might preserve some form of Roman authority, he chose to fight. But here's the detail that makes this moment so tragically ironic. When he called upon a Roman army to defend the empire, he discovered that there was no Roman army left to call. The legions that answered the summons were composed almost entirely of barbarian federati, Germanic and Hun and Sarmatian warriors who fought under Roman eagles but dreamed of their own homes, their own gods, their own ways of life. When these men were asked to fight their kinsman Odoacer, many simply refused. Others quietly slipped away in the night, taking their weapons and their loyalty with them. The empire was being dissolved not by conquest, but by withdrawal consent. The barbarians weren't breaking down the gates of Rome. They were walking away from them, no longer willing to pretend that the dying empire deserved their service. And in the palace of Ravenna, 16-year-old Romulus Augustulus was about to learn that being emperor means nothing when you have no one left to command. September 4th, 476 AD, the date that would echo through history like the sound of a great bell tolling, marking the end of one age and the beginning of another. The morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crisp autumn air that makes every sound carry further than it should. In the palace at Ravenna, servants moved through their daily routines with the mechanical precision of people trying to maintain normalcy in the face of approaching chaos. They laid out the young emperor's purple robes, prepared his morning meal of bread and wine, arranged the day's documents for his review, all the elaborate ceremonies of power, continuing even as the foundation of that power crumbled beneath their feet. But listen carefully, and you can hear it. The distant sound of metal on metal, the rhythm of marching feet, the low murmur of many voices speaking languages that are not quite Latin. Odoacer's army has reached the gates of Ravenna, and they are not bothering to hide their approach. Young Romulus Augustulus stands at his chamber window, watching dust clouds rise on the horizon. His tutors and advisors cluster behind him like mourners at a funeral, their faces pale with the realization that all their careful plans, all their political maneuvering, all their dreams of restoring Roman glory have come to nothing. The boy emperor turns to them with questions that no one can answer. Where are our legions? Where are the loyal soldiers who swore to die for Rome? The terrible truth is that there are no loyal soldiers anymore, because there is no Rome left to be loyal to. The empire has become a hollow shell, a beautiful facade with nothing but emptiness behind it. The men who march with Odoacer are not rebels or invaders. They are Romans in everything but name, Romans who have decided that the time has come to strip away the pretense and build something new from the ruins of something that has already died. But here, in this moment of ultimate crisis, something unexpected happens. Instead of cowering in his palace, instead of fleeing like his predecessors, young Romulus Augustulus makes a decision that transforms him from a mere footnote in history into something approaching genuine nobility. He orders the gates opened, not in surrender, not in defeat, but in a gesture so unprecedented, so contrary to everything emperors were supposed to do, that it stops Odoacer's army in its tracks. The last emperor of Rome walks out to meet his conqueror not as a suppliant begging for mercy, but as one ruler greeting another with the dignity that the situation demands. Picture this scene, and let it burn itself into your memory. A 16-year-old boy in purple silk, surrounded by the faded magnificence of imperial regalia, walking across the courtyard of his palace toward a Germanic chieftain whose very presence represents the end of 1,000 years of history. Behind him, the ghosts of every Caesar watch from marble eyes. Before him, the future itself waits with barbarian patience. When they meet in the center of that courtyard, something extraordinary happens. Odoacer, this barbarian who supposedly knows nothing of civilization, greets the young emperor with perfect Roman protocol. He doesn't gloat, doesn't humiliate, doesn't indulge in the petty cruelties that victory so often brings. Instead, he offers Romulus Augustulus something that no one expected, a choice. The terms are simple and shocking in their generosity. The boy can abdicate willingly, formally ending the Western Roman Empire and transferring authority to Germanic rule. In return, he will be granted lands in Campania, a generous pension, and the promise of a peaceful life far from the deadly games of politics. Or he can refuse and face the consequences of a siege that will end only with his death and the death of everyone who serves him. It is, when you think about it, the most Roman solution possible, practical, efficient, and tinged with just enough mercy to preserve honor on both sides. And so, on that autumn afternoon in the palace courtyard in Ravenna, the last emperor of Rome makes the last great decision of the empire, with hands that tremble not from fear but from the weight of history itself. He removes the purple cloak of imperial authority and places it in Odoacer's hands. The crown that had been worn by Augustus, by Marcus Aurelius, by Constantine the Great, is transferred to a barbarian chieftain who promises to preserve what can be preserved and transform what must be transformed. But the story doesn't end here. History has one more twist in store, one final irony that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about civilizations and the barbarians who inherit them. What happened next defied every expectation, every assumption that Romans had held about the barbarian peoples they had spent centuries fighting and fearing. Odoacer didn't burn Ravenna to the ground. He didn't sack the city, didn't massacre the population, didn't even dismantle the complex administrative systems that kept the empire functioning. Instead, he did something so unexpected that Roman historians initially refused to believe their own sources. He became more Roman than the Romans themselves. The Germanic chieftain who had just ended the Western Roman Empire immediately set about preserving it. He maintained the Roman Senate, honored Roman law, protected Roman citizens, and governed with a combination of barbarian efficiency and Roman dignity that hadn't been seen in the empire for generations. He even continued to mint coins bearing Roman symbols, as if to reassure the world that civilization itself hadn't ended. It had simply changed management. But perhaps the most extraordinary detail of all is what happened to young Romulus Augustulus. The boy who had been the last emperor of Rome was granted not just safety, but genuine respect. Odoacer provided him with the promised lands and pension, allowing him to live out his days as a private citizen in the countryside of Campania. And here's where the story becomes almost mythical in its strangeness. Historical record suggests that the former emperor actually thrived in his new life, becoming something he never could have been on the throne, truly free. Imagine him in his 30s, walking through vineyards that produce wine he actually owns, sleeping in a bed that is his by right rather than by accident of birth, reading books not because they contain useful intelligence about enemies and allies, but simply because they give him joy. The boy who was briefly the most powerful person in the world discovered that powerlessness could be its own kind of salvation. Meanwhile, the man who replaced him was facing challenges that would have broken a lesser ruler. Odoacer found himself governing not just the territories of the former Western Empire, but the impossible expectations of both Romans and barbarians who wanted him to be somehow both revolutionary and traditional, foreign and familiar. Strong enough to maintain order, but gentle enough to preserve the culture they loved. The historical record shows that he succeeded beyond anyone's reasonable expectations. For 17 years, longer than many legitimate Roman emperors, Odoacer ruled Italy with a combination of Germanic pragmatism and Roman sophistication that created something entirely new, a post-Roman kingdom that preserved the best of both worlds while discarding the worst of each. He rebuilt the infrastructure that decades of civil war had damaged, restored trade relationships that political chaos had severed, and perhaps most importantly, he proved that the end of an empire didn't have to mean the end of civilization. In fact, under his rule, many parts of Italy experienced a prosperity and stability that they hadn't known for decades. But history, as always, had one more surprise in store. In 493 AD, Odoacer himself will be murdered by another barbarian king, Theodoric the Great, in a political assassination that mirrored the very Roman plotting and betrayal that had brought down the empire in the first place. The circle was complete. Barbarians had learned to be Romans so perfectly that they had even mastered Roman treachery. Yet the story that began with the fall of the Western Roman Empire continued long after its last emperor disappeared into peaceful obscurity, and its barbarian successor fell to barbarian ambition. The Roman Senate continued to meet in the Forum. Roman law continued to govern millions of lives. Latin continued to be the language of scholarship and administration. The city of Rome itself, though diminished, continued to be Rome. What died in 476 AD was not Roman civilization, but the Roman Empire's claim to eternal dominion. What was born was something more modest, more human, more sustainable, a collection of kingdoms that preserve Roman ideals while adapting them to Germanic realities. And somewhere in the hills of Campania, an old man who had once been emperor tended his vines and remembered a time when he believed that empires could last forever, not knowing that their real immortality lay not in their power, but in their capacity to transform their conquerors into versions of themselves. Now, as our journey through these final moments draws to its close, let us step outside of time itself and see this story for what it truly is. Not the tale of an ending, but of a transformation so profound that we are still living with its consequences 1,500 years later. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was not like the collapse of other great civilizations. When the Aztec Empire fell to Spanish conquistadors, it truly ended. Its gods were forgotten, its languages suppressed, its traditions buried beneath foreign rule. When the Byzantine Empire finally fell to the Ottomans in 1453, Constantinople became Istanbul, and the last traces of Roman authority in the East vanished forever. But the Western Empire died differently. It died by absorption, by transformation, by a kind of historical alchemy that turned barbarian kings into Roman successors and Roman traditions into European foundations. The German chieftain who ended the empire became the guardian of its legacy. The boy emperor who lost his throne found his freedom. The senators who witnessed the end of their world discovered that they could continue to be senators in a world that no longer needed emperors. Consider this remarkable fact. Today, in the 21st century, you still live in a world shaped by Roman ideas. The legal system that governs your life traces its origins to Roman law. The languages spoken across Europe and the Americas carry Latin in their DNA. The very concept of republican government that powers modern democracies was born in the Roman Forum. The architectural principles that shape your cities were first perfected by Roman engineers, whose names we have forgotten, but whose work endures. Even the Catholic Church, which would rise to fill the spiritual vacuum left by the empire's political collapse, was essentially a Roman institution wearing Christian robes, hierarchical, administrative, universal in its ambitions, Latin in its language, Roman in its understanding of how authority should function across vast distances and diverse populations. But perhaps the most profound legacy of that September day in 476 AD is this. It taught the world that civilizations need not die with their political systems. When the Western Empire fell, Romans discovered that they could remain Roman without an emperor, just as today we might discover that we can remain human without the structures we assume are permanent. The barbarians who inherited Rome's territories learned something equally important. That conquest is not the same as destruction, that there can be honor in preservation as well as in victory, that sometimes the greatest act of strength is knowing when to be gentle with what you have defeated. As you drift now towards sleep, let your mind rest on this image. Somewhere in the hills outside Rome, in a place where wildflowers grow between ancient stones and shepherds still speak words that echo across centuries, the wind carries voices from that distant September day when a boy learned that empires end but stories endure, when a barbarian chieftain discovered that civilization is not a birthright but a choice, when the eternal city breathed its last imperial breath and began to dream of all the different ways it might live forever. The last emperor of Rome sleeps peacefully in soil that remembers the footsteps of Caesar and dreams of futures that Caesar never imagined. The barbarian king who replaced him has long since returned to the earth that made him, but his decision to preserve rather than destroy echoes in every legal code, every democratic ideal, every act of mercy between enemies who might have chosen cruelty instead. And Rome herself? She endures, not as an empire, but as an idea. The revolutionary notion that human beings can build something larger than themselves, something that outlasts their own brief lives, something worthy of both barbarian admiration and imperial nostalgia. Listen now, in the quiet moments before sleep takes you, and you might still hear it. The sound of marble remembering glory, of Latin words whispered in monastery gardens, of civilizations learning to die gracefully, so that something even more beautiful might be born from their patient, transformative decay. The empire ended, but the story goes on forever. Sleep now, and let the gentle ghosts of Rome carry you safely through the dark, knowing that some things that seem to end are really just beginning to become something else entirely. Something that might surprise us all with its capacity for rebirth, renewal, an eternal human dream of building paradise on earth, one carefully laid stone at a time.